بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in this series on Al-Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims. In the last episode we were discussing the fifth of the major maxims, Al-Qawaid al-Khams al-Kubra, and that was Al-Adatu Muhakkama. Custom is an arbiter. So we didn't quite finish the topic, so we'll continue with that and then move on to one of its corollaries. We discussed the meaning of the maxim, we discussed the parameters, when it applies, when custom has legal weight, and we also talked about the Sharia evidence for the principle of using custom to determine certain Sharia rulings. So now let's look at some of the applications of this principle. Because I live in Malaysia, let me give you a Malaysian example. A person in Malaysia sold a good to another for deferred payment, and the price that they agreed to was 1,000. So at the time of payment, the buyer pays 1,000 ringgits. Ringgit is the Malaysian currency. And the seller says, hey, wait a minute, I meant dollars. So they take it to a court. In that situation, the judgment would go in favor of the buyer because the currency that everybody uses to settle payments in Malaysia is ringgits. So unless some other currency was specified, then the de facto ruling goes in favor of the custom. A contemporary example that's highly relevant is with regard to theft. So obviously there's a penalty for stealing. Every Muslim knows that. The term for stealing in Arabic is sariqa, and sariqa is defined as furtively, secretly taking the property of another from a protected place. So this protected place is called hirz. Now, this definition is based on the linguistic meaning of the word sariqa. So what does it mean to be a protected place? Well, even in the classical era, in the past, scholars mention that the place for the protection of a particular commodity may differ depending upon what that commodity is. And in our time, if we look at money, most of the money that is existent in the world today is in an electronic form. It's not physical money. In fact, the actual paper and coins that people use to settle the exchange of goods and services in, I don't know how it is in India, but in the West, it's a tiny minority. Paper currency and metal coins are a small minority of what is used to pay for goods and services. So where is electronic money stored? Stored in a computer in a bank. So if somebody steals, he enters the computer, through the internet, and he breaches the firewall, and he breaches all of the security procedures for getting access to those accounts. And he transfers money out of that computer into an account in another computer. Has he committed theft? Well, he hasn't physically entered the location, but he has taken money from the place that in this time is considered the place of safekeeping for it, that computer behind its firewall. And so, yes, he has committed theft. That the penalty for theft would apply to a person who does that. Kind of mentioned this earlier, the rights and duties of husbands and wives are in part determined by custom. And that's why you keep seeing throughout the Quran when issues of treatment of husbands toward their wives or vice versa, that the word urf and ma'ruf keeps recurring in those texts. So what is appropriate in a given time and place and for a given social class would not be appropriate in another time and another place and for another social class. Another example, if we turn to the world of commerce, in the traditional era, a sale took place by a buyer offering his good and the seller saying, I accept. Okay, then they exchange the good and the payment, and the transaction is completed. This was done face to face, and the actual taking of the good was immediate, and the taking of the payment was immediate. And some scholars, like Imam Shafi, who tended to be very literal and very concerned with outer forms, he's famous for an opinion where he said, in that traditional situation, if the customer picks up a good from the wares of the buyer, he puts it on the counter and he puts down money, and the seller takes the money, gives him his change, and the buyer walks out with the good. The famous opinion of Imam Shafi in that regard is that if they didn't say anything, that sale is invalid. And that's a real minority opinion. Ibn Qudama, in arguing against it, he said, this is the traditional way that people have been exchanging goods and services for time immemorial. And there's no Sharia text that the Prophet ﷺ told people that they had to change that behavior. The offer to buy comes when the customer puts the good in front of the seller and puts his money down. And the seller's acceptance of the bargain is when he takes the money and gives the change. And then the customer walks out with it. That's a valid sale according to almost all scholars. Even in the Shafi madhab, the later Shafi scholars downplayed this ruling, and they said what Imam Shafi meant is that this is not valid when the value of the item is high, it's an expensive item. Anyway, we have another feature of how custom changes over time in our time, which is that with every passing year, more and more of trade occurs on the internet. In these situations, the buyer and the seller actually, they never see each other. And the seller, there's probably not a person who's in real time on the other side of the customer when he does the transaction. The customer pulls up a display on his computer screen in which he sees various goods and their prices, and he clicks on a mouse that I want this item, I want 3 of those, and I want this color. And so then the computer asks for his credit card information, and that is wired across. And then the seller's computer checks with the credit card issuer, who acts as a guarantor in this transaction. Most modern transactions are not two-way transactions, they're three-way transactions. There's a buyer, a seller, and a guarantor. So when the guarantor says, okay, I agree to guarantee that payment will be received, then on the seller's side, the transaction is accepted. And then the buyer is informed that, okay, this transaction is complete, and then somebody will eventually, on the seller side, process that information and put the good in a box and give it to a courier or put it in the mail, and it will reach the buyer sometime later. Is this form of transaction valid in the Sharia? It is. I don't know of any contemporary scholar who says that's invalid, because the essential requirements of a sale is that the buyer and the seller be legally fit to conduct transactions, and that there should be an offer and an acceptance. And once those occur, whether it's by verbal means, written means, electronic means, and both parties know that they've agreed to these terms, then that's a valid sale. Another really important manifestation of this principle, I can't overemphasize what an amazing statement this is by Imam Malik. He said, if the public were to accept leather as a medium of exchange and turn it into minted money. Okay, we're going to take a break and we'll finish this on the other side. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Hussein Hamid Hassan. You are watching Peace TV, the solution for humanity.
We are not addicted to dawah. Addiction implies a short-term fix. One doesn't need to get into the zone to talk about Islam. You do dawah because it is a natural result of your commitment to Allah. If you don't talk, people are going to walk. The most effective combination in the propagation of true Islam is found in Dawah ilallah. Join me, Arib Islam, as we go through Dawah ilallah only on Peace TV.
Follow the tips to make the task of Dawah result-oriented in Dawah ilallah tomorrow at 11:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 6 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV. Dialogue. Discussion. Debate. Rebuttal. Conclusion.
Eliminate misconceptions about religion. Get enlightened.
Witness Dr. Zakir Naik in a battle of words in Crossfire, next on Peace TV.
Welcome back. We're talking about applications of this whole concept of custom being an arbiter. And we're talking about the statement of Imam Malik. This is recorded in Al-Mudawwana, which is questions and answers, his students asking him questions about certain issues, and they recorded his answers. So Mudawwana means recorded. So he was asked about whether the rules of riba apply to fulus. Fulus was a kind of coin that made its appearance after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, coins that were not either gold or silver. So the question arose, do the rules of riba in exchanging gold and silver also apply to fulus? So Imam Malik, he made this sweeping statement, which is really, really important for understanding the whole issue of money and riba. He said, if the public were to accept leather as a medium of exchange and turn it into minted money, so, the leather is cut into bills, okay, so that's a leather equivalent of paper money. He said, if they were to do that, I would detest its sale for gold and silver for deferred payment. So the issue that he's talking about is that exchanges of gold and silver must happen immediately. The buyer and the seller cannot depart without both parties having received the counter value in that transaction. So he said that this same rule would apply to an exchange of fulus for gold or silver, or anything that people accept as payment for goods and services. So The implications of that are very far-reaching, and I'll return to that, inshallah, in a future episode when we talk about the nature of money, inshallah. So the issue there is that what people accept as payment for goods and services takes the role of gold and silver, and that the rules of currency exchange, sarf, and the rules of riba apply to whatever it is that people accept. So that's some of the applications of the basic maxim. Now this maxim has a number of corollaries. Inshallah, we'll try to get to at least one of them. Al-ma'rufu urfan kal-mashruti shartan. We've dealt with some of the applications actually of this subsidiary maxim already. A matter recognized by custom is like a contractual stipulation. And another major corollary of it is al-kitabu kal-khitab. Writing is treated like speech. Now this maxim is almost obsolete in our time, or it's inverted, in the sense that when it comes to contracts, the basic rule for contracts is that they should be written down, because one of the major objectives of the Sharia is that there shouldn't be disputes in transactions. So if it's just left up to our memory of, well, I said this, you said that, I said, no, you didn't, there's much more room for dispute than if it's written down and there's witnesses. So the basic means by which contracts are secured in our time is writing. And oral means are like a secondary means of confirmation. Another principle that is mentioned as a corollary of this maxim is لا ينكر تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان. Evolution of Sharia rulings due to changing times is not to be denied. Now, the wording here, what I translated right now is pretty much according to what the explicit wording says. But the intended meaning is actually more restricted than that. So let me read it again with the restriction added. Evolution of Sharia rulings based on custom and ijtihad due to changing times is not to be denied. So, inshallah, that will be the topic of another session. Now, if we look at this subsidiary maxim, al-ma'rufu urfan kal-mashruti shartan, a matter recognized by custom is like a contractual stipulation. The evidence for it is the same as for its parent maxim. Let's look at some other applications of it. Let's say that a father sends his son to a craftsman in order to learn a discipline. Now, in the West, this is obsolete, but in a lot of Muslim countries, this is something that's still going on. So somehow they don't quite make the terms of their agreement explicit. And at the end of the first month, the craftsman, he tells the father, okay, well, you need to pay me now. And the father says, no, you need to pay me. The craftsman argues, look, you sent your son here to learn, and I'm teaching him, so that I need to be paid for teaching him. And the father says, you're putting my son to work, he's helping you do your work, he's a laborer, he needs to be paid for his labor. So in that situation, how do you decide? From the get-go, they should have talked about this issue to begin with. But if it reaches that point and it was brought to somebody who had to decide the issue, then the basis for determining what the rule is in that case would be to look at custom. If somebody is apprenticed in this kind of a situation, who's the party that would end up paying for the arrangement? Another classical example of this is, and here we come to the meaning of words. The term dabba in the Arabic language is quite broad. It means any creature that moves across the earth. So on four legs, on two legs, on its belly, all of those are considered dabba. But in many Arabic lands in the Middle Ages, dabba, more specifically, people would use that to refer to a donkey. So if somebody were to, in those days, to have hired a dabba for riding purposes, and the leasor provides him with a donkey, and he says, wait a minute, you know, I meant a horse, then his claim that he should be given a horse because he wanted a dabba would be rejected, because what people think of when they hear the word dabba in that context and in that time would be donkey. Let's say, in terms of, this could be Islamic finance, although again in the modern era it would be unlikely that this would really come up, so maybe it's more useful as a classical example. When a person sets up a waqf, a charitable endowment, he would appoint somebody to manage it. So that's called a nazir. So managing a waqf requires that person's time and energy, and normally the person who is asked to do that is asked to do it because they have a certain amount of skill in management. So if the waqif, the person who set up this waqf, he didn't stipulate the amount of remuneration that the nazir should receive for doing this service, then the point of reference would be custom. And this is a special term in Arabic, they call it ujratul mithl. So what would a manager of an enterprise comparable to whatever it is that that nazir is managing, what would be the going wage for a person doing that kind of work in that place and time? So that's what that manager should be paid for his services. An example of that's really pertinent to Islamic banking is the whole concept of giving a gift. Now, when a person opens an account in an Islamic bank, if it's a wadi'a account, it means that they put their money in it and the bank will treat it as a loan. And because it's a loan, then the depositor doesn't expect to get any money back. There will be no interest paid on that account. If, for some reason, the bank chooses of its own accord after a period of time to give the depositor a hiba, a gift, that in and of itself as an isolated act would not be prohibited. But if it becomes customary that every depositor who deposits his money in such an account expects a gift on a regular basis, then there's no difference between that gift and riba, even though it's not a contractual stipulation. Nowhere is it mentioned in the contract that the bank must give this gift. But if it becomes a matter that everybody knows this is going to happen and they expect it, then this maxim would apply and prohibit that practice. There's another concept in the Sharia which is qabd. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, don't sell what you don't possess. And so qabd literally means grabbing. So grab hold of it and you hold it, you've now taken possession. That was the classical meaning of qabd. There are certain applications today where the seller, he gives the buyer access to the good. And even he may not physically take possession of it, but it's considered possession in the market practice. So scholars have ruled that kind of possession is called constructive possession rather than literal possession, and that it also fulfills the condition of qabd in certain situations. We've run out of time, so assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.